Have you ever noticed how in movies the hero can blow up half a city and everyone cheers, but if the villain so much as knocks over a fruit stand, it's a sign of pure evil? Well, that's pretty much how international politics has worked for the last 500 years. It's a story of double standards, where the rules of the game change depending on who is playing. This isn't a new thing, it's a system that was carefully built over centuries. It started way back in 1492 when European explorers sailed across the ocean and decided that discovering a place meant it was theirs. The people already living there? Their opinions didn't seem to matter much. This was the beginning of a global mindset where some people were seen as advanced and civilized, while others were seen as needing to be managed or controlled. This idea created a two-tiered world. On one level you had the powerful European empires, who made the rules. They fought wars among themselves, sure, but they had gentlemen's agreements and treaties. Then, on another level, you had everyone else in the world, in Africa, Asia and the Americas. For them, the rules were different. Their lands could be taken, their resources could be stolen, and their people could be oppressed, all in the name of progress or civilization. It was a global system where justice was not blind. It was squinting very hard to see who was who. This wasn't just a simple case of bullying, it was the creation of a legal and moral framework where what was a crime for one group was considered a necessity for another. Think of it like this: if your big brother makes a rule that no one can eat cookies before dinner, but then you see him sneaking a few, what do you learn? You learn that the rule isn't really about cookies. It's about who has the power to make and break the rules. This is exactly what happened on a global scale. The powerful nations of Europe wrote the first drafts of what we now call international law. But these laws were designed to manage their relationships with each other, not to protect the people they were colonizing. So, while it was wrong for one European power to invade another, it was somehow acceptable for them to invade and occupy lands far away, because those lands and people were outside their special club. This history is not just some old story from a textbook, it's the foundation of the world we live in today. The same logic that said a European king could claim a foreign land is the ancestor of the logic that today decides which countries get sanctions and which get military aid. It's the reason why one country's invasion is called a liberation, while another's is called an illegal occupation. This long history of picking favorites, of creating one set of rules for the powerful and another for the powerless, has set the stage for centuries of conflict. And nowhere is this more visible than in the story of the Middle East, a region whose modern history was engineered by these very same double standards. Picture this. It's the middle of World War I and two European diplomats, a Brit named Mark Sykes and a Frenchman named François-Georges Picot, are sitting in a room with a map. They're not planning a vacation, they're secretly carving up the entire Middle East. With a ruler and a pencil they drew a line across the sand, deciding which parts of the dying Ottoman Empire would belong to Britain and which would belong to France. This wasn't a negotiation with the people who actually lived there. It was a backroom deal, a secret handshake that would decide the fate of millions. The Arabs had been promised independence if they helped the British fight the Ottomans, but this agreement showed that was never the real plan. The Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916 was the ultimate example of colonial arrogance. It completely ignored the rich tapestry of cultures, tribes, and religions that had coexisted in the region for centuries. The lines they drew on the map were artificial. They lumped together rival groups and split communities in half. It was like taking a pizza, cutting it into bizarre, nonsensical slices, and telling everyone they had to live with their new, awkward piece. This act of drawing lines without consent created the modern borders of countries like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. It planted the seeds for future conflicts by creating states that were inherently unstable, forcing people with different histories and loyalties to live under one flag, often a flag they didn't choose. This agreement wasn't just about territory, it was about control. Britain and France wanted to secure their own interests in the region, primarily oil and strategic trade routes. They weren't thinking about creating peaceful, prosperous nations for the Arab people. They were thinking about how to maintain their power after the war. The promise of Arab independence was just a convenient lie, a tool to get what they wanted. This betrayal taught a painful lesson to the people of the Middle East. Promises from powerful Western nations were not to be trusted. It created a deep sense of resentment and a feeling that their destiny was not in their own hands, but in the hands of faraway empires. The legacy of Sykes-Picot is still felt today. the artificial borders they created have been at the heart of countless wars and civil conflicts. Groups like ISIS later tried to erase these very lines, claiming to undo the colonial legacy. The agreement established a pattern that would be repeated over and over again, powerful countries making decisions for others based on their own self-interest, with no regard for the human consequences. It cemented the idea that the Middle East was a chessboard for great powers to play on, not a home for the people who lived there. And this was just the first of many promises that would be made and broken in the region. Just a year after Sykes and Picot drew their secret lines, Britain made another promise that would echo through history. In 1917, the British Foreign Secretary, Arthur Balfour, sent a letter to a prominent British Jewish leader, Lord Rothschild. This letter, which became known as the Balfour Declaration, was short, only 67 words long, but it was one of the most consequential documents of the 20th century. It stated that the British government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. At the time, Britain didn't even control Palestine. It was still part of the Ottoman Empire. Yet here they were, promising a land they didn't own to a people who mostly didn't live there. The declaration was a masterpiece of political calculation and vague language. It was designed to win the support of Jewish communities in Britain, America, and Russia for the Allied war effort, but it contained a massive contradiction. While it promised a national home for the Jewish people, it also said that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. The problem was, at that time, these non-Jewish communities, the Palestinian Arabs, made up over 90% of the population. How could you create a national home for one group in a land that was already home to another, without affecting their rights? It was like promising your friend he could move his entire family into your roommate's bedroom, but assuring your roommate it wouldn't inconvenience him at all. This promise was a classic example of a double standard. Britain was essentially making two conflicting promises to two different groups. They had already hinted at independence for the Arabs in exchange for their help in the war. Now, they were promising the same land as a homeland for the Zionist movement. The British government saw Palestine not as a place with a living, breathing population, but as a piece of real estate to be used for its own geopolitical advantage. The rights and aspirations of the majority of its inhabitants were treated as a minor detail, a footnote in a larger imperial plan. This set the stage for an inevitable conflict between two peoples with competing claims to the same land. The Balfour Declaration fundamentally changed the future of Palestine. It gave international legitimacy to the Zionist project, which until then had been a political aspiration. With the backing of the world's most powerful empire, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, and so did the tensions between the new arrivals and the existing Arab population. The declaration was a clear sign that when it came to making decisions about the Middle East, the wishes of the indigenous people were secondary to the strategic interests of Western powers. It was not a quest for justice, it was a power play, and it laid the groundwork for a conflict that over a century later continues to define the region. After World War II, the world was reeling, and the horrors of the Holocaust created a powerful wave of international sympathy for the Jewish people and their dream of a state. The British, exhausted from the war, and unable to manage the escalating violence in Palestine between Jewish militias and Arab residents, decided to hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. In 1947, the UN proposed a plan to partition Palestine into two states, one for Jews and one for Arabs, with the city of Jerusalem to be administered internationally. On paper, it might have looked like a fair compromise, a way to give both groups what they wanted. However, the plan had a major flaw from the perspective of the Arab population. The proposed Jewish state was allocated 56% of the land, even though Jews owned only about 7% of the private land and made up about one-third of the population. The Arab majority was offered a state on a smaller, fragmented piece of territory. Unsurprisingly, the Arab leaders and the Palestinian population rejected the plan, seeing it as deeply unfair and another example of the international community favoring the Zionist project at their expense. The Jewish leadership, on the other hand, accepted the plan. It was a green light from the world's highest authority to create their state. In 1948, when the British mandate ended, Israel declared its independence. Immediately, neighboring Arab states invaded, sparking the 1948 Arab-Israeli War. By the end of the war, Israel controlled even more land than the UN partition plan had allocated, about 78% of historic Palestine. For Israelis, this was a war of independence, a fight for survival. But for Palestinians, it was the Nakba, or the catastrophe. Over 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes or fled the violence, becoming refugees in neighboring countries and in the remaining parts of Palestine, the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Their villages were destroyed, and they were never allowed to return. This event created one of the world's longest-running refugee crises. The creation of Israel was seen by the West as a just and necessary act, a historic redemption for the Jewish people. But for the Palestinians, it was an act of profound injustice, where they paid the price for a European crime, the Holocaust, and lost their homeland in the process. The world's powerful nations, particularly the United States, quickly recognized and supported the new state of Israel, while the plight of the Palestinian refugees was largely ignored. This set a precedent. The rights and history of one group were prioritized, while the rights and history of another were dismissed. The double standard was now etched into the very geography of the land. After 1948, the United States, stepped into Britain's shoes as the main power broker in the Middle East, and it brought its own set of double standards with it. Over the decades, the U.S. formed a uniquely close alliance with Israel, providing it with billions of dollars in military and economic aid. This support has made Israel one of the most powerful military forces in the region. While the U.S. has often spoken about the need for a two-state solution and peace, its actions have, honestly, consistently favored one side. This relationship has become the ultimate example of how international rules about justice and accountability apply to some countries, but not to others. For decades, the United Nations has passed, countless resolutions condemning Israeli actions, such as the building of settlements on occupied Palestinian land in the West Bank. According to international law, these settlements are illegal. However, the United States has consistently used its veto power in the UN Security Council to block any resolutions that would hold Israel accountable. If another country were to occupy territory and move its citizens there, it would face international sanctions and condemnation, but because Israel is a key U.S. ally, it has been shielded from any meaningful consequences. It's like a referee who ignores fouls from his favorite team. This pattern is not just about blocking resolutions, it's about shaping the entire narrative. When Palestinians resist the occupation, their actions are often labeled as terrorism. But when the Israeli military responds with overwhelming force, killing far more civilians in the process, it is often described as self-defense. This difference in language is, honestly, crucial. It creates a moral hierarchy where one side's violence is seen as legitimate and necessary, while the other's is seen as criminal and evil. The U.S. has helped create a world where the context of a 57-year-long military occupation is often erased from the conversation, making it seem like the conflict started yesterday with an act of Palestinian aggression. This protection has created a culture of impunity. When you know you have a powerful friend who will always have your back, you don't have to worry about following the rules. This has allowed the occupation to deepen and the possibility of a Palestinian state to shrink. American presidents from both parties have followed this same playbook, talking about peace while sending weapons and blocking accountability. This isn't just about being a good ally, it's about maintaining a strategic foothold in a vital region. But the cost of this friendship has been the denial of justice for Palestinians and the erosion of the very idea of a single universal standard for international law. The double standards in the Middle East don't exist in a vacuum. They're, part of a global pattern where international law is used as a tool by the powerful, not as a shield for the weak. Two recent examples make this crystal clear: the 2003 invasion of Iraq and the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine. In both cases, a powerful country invaded a smaller one. But the world's reaction could not have been more different, and that difference tells you everything you need to know about how the system works. It shows that the crime is not the invasion itself, but really, who is doing the invading and who is being invaded. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq based on claims that the country had weapons of mass destruction. These claims later turned out to be false. The invasion did not have the approval of the UN Security Council and was considered illegal by many international law experts, including the UN Secretary General at the time. Yet there were no sanctions against the United States. There were no calls to seize the assets of American leaders, and no one was put on trial for the crime of aggression. The United States and its allies were the judge, jury, and executioner. They defined their own mission as a liberation, and the world, for the most part, had to accept it. Now, let's fast forward to 2022. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the international response was swift and strong. Led by the United States and Europe, the world imposed crippling economic sanctions on Russia. Russian assets were frozen, its leaders were labeled war criminals, and the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. The world rallied behind Ukraine, sending billions in military aid and calling the invasion a gross violation of international law and national sovereignty. And it was. But the question is, why was this violation treated so differently from the invasion of Iraq? The answer is simple. The rules were applied by the same people who had broken them before. This stark contrast exposes the hypocrisy at the heart of the international system. It shows that international law is not a consistent set of principles, but a flexible tool that powerful nations use against their enemies and ignore when it applies to themselves or their friends. When Russia breaks the rules, the system works exactly as it should. But when the United States or an ally like Israel breaks them, the system suddenly short-circuits. This selective application of justice sends a clear message to the rest of the world. Do as I say, not as I do. It undermines the very credibility of institutions like the UN and the ICC, making them look like instruments of Western power rather than impartial arbiters of justice. And this brings us to Gaza. The current crisis, which escalated dramatically after the horrific Hamas attacks on October 7, 2023, is the direct result of this long history of double standards. For 17 years before that, Gaza had been under a suffocating blockade by Israel and Egypt, which turned the tiny strip of land into what many have called the world's largest open-air prison. The movement of people and goods was severely restricted, crippling its economy and making life unbearable for its 2 million residents. The world largely ignored this slow-burning humanitarian crisis. It was a form of collective punishment, which is illegal under international law, but it was allowed to continue because it was being done by a friend. After the Hamas attacks, in which over 1,400 Israelis were killed and more than 200 were taken hostage, acts that are unequivocally war crimes, Israel launched a military campaign in Gaza of unprecedented scale and intensity. In response, Israel declared a complete siege, cutting off water, food, fuel, and electricity. Entire neighborhoods were flattened. As of late 2024, tens of thousands of Palestinians, a huge percentage of them women and children, have been killed. Human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and even the International Court of Justice, have warned that Israel's actions show clear evidence of genocidal acts and intent, citing the scale of killing and statements from Israeli officials. Here is where the double standard becomes impossible to ignore. While the world rightly condemned Hamas's atrocities, the response to Israel's actions has been muted and contradictory, especially from its powerful allies. The same countries that rushed to sanction Russia for its actions in Ukraine have continued to send weapons to Israel. The United States has used its veto power at the UN to block resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire. The International Criminal Court sought arrest warrants for leaders of both Hamas and Israel, but Western leaders rushed to condemn the move against Israeli officials, calling it outrageous. Suddenly, the idea of holding leaders accountable for war crimes became controversial. The situation in Gaza is the ultimate stress test for the international legal system, and the system is failing. The message being sent is that some lives are worth more than others. Some victims deserve justice and others do not. The rules of war designed to protect civilians appear to be optional. While the world watches a humanitarian catastrophe unfold in real time, the mechanisms that were built to prevent such tragedies are paralyzed by the same old politics of picking favorites. The crisis in Gaza is not an accident. It is the predictable outcome of a global system that was engineered to produce precisely these kinds of unequal outcomes. It's tempting to look at all this, the broken promises, the selective justice, the vetoes at the UN, and say that the international system is broken. But what if it's not? What if the system is working exactly as it was designed to? The modern international order was built by powerful colonial empires after major world wars. It was designed to manage the world in a way that protected their interests and maintained their dominance. The idea of universal human rights and equal justice for all was a beautiful and inspiring promise, but it was always secondary to the realities of power politics. The system wasn't built for a Palestinian child in the same way it was built for a politician in Washington or London. The United Nations, for example, is often held up as the symbol of global cooperation, but its most powerful body, the Security Council, gives permanent membership and veto power to just 5 countries: the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. These were the victors of World War II. This structure ensures that no action can be taken against the interests of these major powers or their closest allies. So when the United States wants to protect Israel from accountability, it can simply use its veto. When Russia wants to block action against its invasion of Ukraine, it can do the same. This isn't a flaw in the system, it's the system's core feature. Similarly, institutions like the International Criminal Court have been criticized for their own double standards. For most of its history, the ICC has overwhelmingly prosecuted leaders from African nations, leading to accusations that it is a tool of Western neo-colonialism. It has been slow or unwilling to investigate powerful actors from the West or their allies. The fact that the ICC prosecutors' request for arrest warrants for Israeli leaders was met with threats and outrage from the United States shows just how much pressure is applied to keep the scales of justice tilted. The law is supposed to be above politics, but in the international arena, it is almost always downstream from it. So, the problem is not a few bad apples or a few broken rules. The problem is the orchard itself. The global order was designed to maintain a hierarchy, and that hierarchy persists today. It's a system where international law often means rules that the powerful apply to the weak, but not to themselves. This explains why the call for justice for Palestinians has gone unanswered for so long. It's not because their case is weak, or their suffering is invisible. It's because within this system, they are on the wrong side of the power equation. Acknowledging this is not cynical, it is the first step toward understanding the true nature of the challenge. So, after centuries of engineered history and carefully crafted double standards, where does that leave us? It leaves us with a world where the word justice has a different meaning depending on your passport and your allies. It leaves us with a crisis in Gaza that is a textbook case of what happens when one group of people is systematically dehumanized and denied the protections that are supposedly universal. The rules of war, human rights, and international law have failed the people of Palestine not because the rules themselves are bad, but because the will to apply them fairly has never been there. The system didn't just fail, it was designed to fail them. But recognizing that the game is rigged is not a reason to give up. In fact, it's the most important reason to fight for change. The power of the old empires is not what it once was. We live in a world that is more connected than ever before. Thanks to social media and independent journalism, people can now see for themselves the reality of what is happening in places like Gaza. The official narratives spun by powerful governments are harder to maintain when we can see videos of bombed-out hospitals and starving children on our phones. This global awareness is creating a new form of power. The power of people demanding consistency and fairness. Changing this system will not be easy. It means demanding that our own governments stop the hypocrisy. It means insisting that if sanctions are right for Russia, then accountability must be right for everyone, including friends and allies. It means supporting institutions that try to apply the law equally, even when it's politically uncomfortable. It means amplifying the voices of those who have been silenced and insisting that their stories are heard. The goal is simple. Even if achieving it is hard to make international law a shield for the weak, not just a weapon for the strong. We need to build a world where a child in Gaza has the same right to life and justice as a child anywhere else. Ultimately, the call for fairness is not a radical idea, it's the most basic human expectation. We teach it to our children on the playground. The rules should be the same for everyone. For too long, the world has been run by a different set of playground rules, where the biggest kid gets to do whatever he wants. The story of Gaza is a painful reminder of the human cost of that system. But it can also be a turning point. It's a chance for the world to look in the mirror and ask whether it truly believes in the values it claims to uphold. Justice should not be a matter of geography or politics. It should be universal, or it is not justice at all.